Hello and welcome to India's World. US President Barack Obama has tried to reset US foreign policy and national security goals in a seminal speech delivered at West Point Military Academy. The speech has been panned by his critics as putting up straw men and then demolishing them. Others have said that the US is finally catching its breath after years of entanglement in intractable conflicts in the Islamic world. To discuss the foreign policy signals coming out of this speech, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Neelam Deb, a distinguished diplomat, India's Consul General in New York, India's Ambassador to Denmark, Ivory Coast. She was also head of the political division in the Indian Embassy in Washington, DC at one point. She is currently the co-founder of Gateway House, a think tank based in Mumbai. And we have Professor Chintamani Mahapatra. He needs no introduction to our viewers, an expert on US foreign policy. He is chair of American Studies at School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Admiral Raja Menon, one of our foremost strategic affairs experts. He was associated with the National Security Council and the National Maritime Foundation. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Neelam, let me begin with you. Do you think President Obama attempted to reset US foreign policy in his speech?
I think he attempted to explain the policies that he has been following. It is well known that he came into the presidency wanting to take American troops out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, and he has certainly proceeded on that quite systematically. In fact, he has announced what is being seen as a premature withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan by the end of 2016, which would be the end of his own term as well. Of course, his critics are saying that that is intended to promote the campaign of a democratic successor. So I think it looks quite a lot like explaining their policies. And in fact, the only new thing and somewhat startling is the announcement of a $5 billion fund, which is really for training what would be seen by anyone else as subversives.
All right, we'll discuss that. We're going to discuss that in a while. Professor Mahapatra, so do you agree with Neelam that Obama's speech was more sort of confirmatory than revelatory about foreign policy? And do you think he's been able to answer his critics because his foreign policy ratings have gone down to the 30s?
You know, there's something which is new and something pretty old. What is old is his effort to portray a foreign policy which will be almost equidistant between interventionism and isolationism. Now, he's talking like a liberal institutionalist where he says we must respect international law, we must respect international institutions and all. So, he's talking all good things which will really please many Indians, many Russians, many Chinese and all that.
Will they please his critics in America?
But it is not pleasing the critics. They're saying that Obama has been resetting his foreign policy time and again, beginning with Russia, which failed. Then he talked about pivot to Asia, which is not taking off the ground. And now yet again he's talking about international institutions because he's preparing to bring the troops back home from Afghanistan and all. So there is nothing new in this except that proposal to have a $5 billion fund to train allied countries to fight terrorism. And that's going to be very, very controversial.
Okay. Admiral, do you agree with them? Because or do you think that Obama was trying to redefine American role in the world? He's basically saying that, look, we are not giving up our leadership role, but we must circumscribe it, we must define it correctly. And do you think this is what he meant when he said the question we face and the question you will face, he was telling the graduating officers, is not whether America will lead. He takes it for granted that America will lead, but how we will lead. Not just to secure our peace and prosperity, but also to extend peace and prosperity around the globe. And then he goes on to explain what he means. So actually, he is lending a perspective, a context to his foreign policy measures. Would you agree?
I agree with that because I think, as you quite rightly said in your opening remarks, I think America is catching his breath. He inherited a lot of overseas engagements, and he is speaking at a military academy. This used to be something that used to be done in this country decades ago. It's not done anymore. And at the military academy, he has chosen to make a policy statement, a policy speech. But at the same time, he is aware that the audience that he is talking to are West Point cadets. And there are certain things that he can't say. Like for instance, he can't tell the cadets that we the Americans have a debt of 18 trillion. He can't say that. He can only say, he can only articulate the policies that they have already been following, in the sense that they did not intervene in Libya, they did not intervene in Syria. He is articulating the reasons as to why the new foreign policy does not require America to intervene in these countries.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think he is not resetting a foreign policy agenda as much as explaining the foreign policy agenda which has already been started.
So would you say that this is America talking to itself? It's an internal dialogue where you are justifying your policy, rationalizing it.
I think it is America talking to itself, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world doesn't listen even
Absolutely.
when America talks to itself. So definitely China will have noticed that there is hardly any reference to the response to its moves in the South China Sea. Surely the Russians will be listening to see whether there was any signal on the Ukraine. And there it is important to note that what Obama said, to really simplify it, oversimplify it, they said that where their own interests are concerned, they will not need the endorsement of any international bodies or other countries. Where America's most crucial critical interests are not involved, they will work with others, but mainly leave the burden on the others to carry it forward. So that's the position.
Okay, Professor Mahapatra, so in a sense, he has tried to reassure his critics that, look, I am not abandoning the US role in shaping the world according to the critical strategic interests of America. But these critical strategic interests need to be clearly defined before any military intervention takes place.
You know what the critics are saying, that you used drones more often than Bush did, and you had a secret war going on in Afghanistan even now. And without winning that war, without declaring victory, you are announcing the date of withdrawal and giving new kinds of inputs and ideas into the Taliban mind. Then in case of Syria, then you had to rush to Moscow and ask them for help to resolve the thing, rather than punish the guys who really crossed the red line.
The point is that he's not able to convince his critics that that he will maintain the US lead role in the world.
The critics are basically saying that he is following a foreign policy which is clearly telling the world around that America has become a weak country. The Russians and the Chinese are calling the shots, and we are not able to confront them.
All right, we'll discuss this further in the next segment, but we need to take a break at this point. We'll continue with this discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing President Barack Obama's West Point speech, where some people say he's tried to reset US foreign policy goals. Admiral Raja Menon, do you think one of the clearest messages of Obama's speech was that while he continued to see US as the sole superpower, that he also conveyed that US was no longer interested in acting alone and dealing with all the problems of the world by itself?
Yeah, he made that very clear. He brought in a quotation from General Eisenhower, who, as you know, led the biggest invasion in history and then went on to become the president, to describe that war is a bad option and that is a terrible option, and that war will be considered as an option only when there is no other option. So the United States, therefore, is not going to take the option to fight in faraway countries at the drop of a hat. They will consider all other options, and he enumerated some of them: economic, financial, diplomatic, and international pressures. And it's only when there is no other alternative will the United States act. But he did mention that the United States will act on certain conditions.
In certain conditions. Professor Mahapatra, do you agree when Obama says that multilateralism has paid off? And he gives two examples. One, he gives of sanctions against Russia on the annexation of Crimea, and the circumstances leading to the possibility of a nuclear deal with Iran. So what has been the past record of US on multilateralism, and has it been any different except for these two examples under President Obama?
I would rather argue that except a few instances, Americans have always been multilateral. Take the example of Korean War. They did not go it alone. Take the example of Afghanistan. 30 plus countries are supporting them. Take the example of the first Gulf War. So many countries supported them. Even in the second Gulf War, there are so many coalition partners, coalition of the willing and all that. So what the Americans do, unilateralism basically means we'll be the leader, we'll set the tone, we'll contribute, but you have to give your political support and minimal support to the USA. So basically the Americans are unilateral all the time, except the mask is that of multilateralism.
But multilateralism, Neelam, would imply that you take the views of others into account. It doesn't mean that you finish off opposition, everybody should accept your leadership. That's not multilateralism.
Not at all. Not at the point of entering a war, say like Afghanistan, or at the point of exit now. Even in Afghanistan, even today, there are troops from other countries. Now, it's really, we can call it whatever we wish to, but the fact is that NATO countries always follow the Americans into
so what is
any
new?
engagement.
What is new in the case of Russia and Iran that Obama is pointing to?
I think in the case of Iran, what is new is that the Middle East has changed. Look at all the eruptions, the awakening or spring or whatever it is to be called in all the countries around Iran that have occurred. And maybe one of the factors that American media often speculates on is the fact that President Obama had very bad relations with the Prime Minister of Israel. So that may be a reason for wanting to change a situation which has really been in stasis for decades now.
Okay, let's leave multilateralism aside, because personally, not that my view matters, but I don't think sanctions against Russia prevented anything in Ukraine. Crimea was annexed, wasn't it?
That is because the European partners, the NATO partners, are dependent on Russian gas by 1/3.
Exactly.
And now the situation has changed so much. And Obama, in the beginning of his speech, when he talks about a new world emerging, and how even countries like Brazil and India are playing an important role and competing with them, then he knows that America cannot behave like a Rambo anymore.
Yeah.
Because Russia, which was an erstwhile enemy, is now partner or energy partner to the European allies and all that. Same is the case with China. Okay. China is running a trade surplus of $275 billion with Americans. Yes. So beyond a point, they cannot sanction China.
Okay. Admiral, do you think that US has, of course, said goodbye to large-scale land wars? And Obama said that now you need to fight terrorism, a new kind of terrorism, which is decentralized, diffused, and it cannot be fought the same way that terrorism was being fought earlier. And he said, in such circumstances, we should not go it alone. Instead, we should mobilize allies and partners to take collective action. We must broaden our tools to include diplomacy and development, sanctions and isolation, appeals to international law, if just necessary and effective, multilateral military action. We must do so because collective action in these circumstances is more likely to succeed, more likely to be sustained, and less likely to lead to costly mistakes. But does this define a new policy of dealing with decentralized terrorism? Or does it just lay the basis for defining it?
In a way, actually, it goes back to the Cold War. In fact, one of the forces that the Americans have, called the Green Berets, were raised for this very purpose, that they would train foreign armed forces in being able to fight insurgencies in their own country. So, the United States, in a way, is going back to a strategy that it has followed earlier. Yeah. The other aspect, of course, is that he has claimed that he has dealt, as he says in the speech, mighty blows against the Al-Qaeda and reduced it to a disparate force. And we still continue to act against them through special forces and drone strikes. Yeah. So that is the kind of strategy that, in fact, he's already instituted that strategy where he has sent with this 5 billion, where he is training forces in the North African countries.
Said the neighbors of
Nigeria.
We are going to come to that.
Yes.
But Neelam, here is Obama talking about multilateralism. But let's take bilateral cooperation from the Indian point of view. Bilateral cooperation on terrorism in this region, or multilateral cooperation, has been virtually non-existent.
Well, that, of course, I think emanates out of the peculiar relationship with Pakistan, because I think there is full acknowledgement, including in testimonies in the US Congress, that all of this is emanating out of Pakistan. But they also feel at the same time so dependent on Pakistan for now disengaging in Afghanistan. So they have not only not cooperated with India very much on terrorism, they have not tried to work out something with any of Afghanistan's other neighbors either, even though the Chinese might have been more receptive now that there have been so many attacks in Xinjiang. They have picked a fight with Russia at the wrong time. So there is not much multilateralism in that.
Yeah, let me take that question to Professor Mahapatra in a slightly different form. Okay, now he has said that troops will come down to 9,800 level by the end of this year, and by the end of 2016, only the security contingent at the embassy at Kabul will remain. But his critics are saying that, all right, this is good, leave the Afghan war to the Afghans, but have a strategy whereby you involve the neighbors of Afghanistan in a coordinated strategy to deal with the Islamic militants. Has he done that?
He has not done that, but I think he's going to do it. What is controversial about the $5 billion proposal that he has, I believe that during the Cold War time, they found the Soviet Union and communism were the major threat. So they had so many kind of alliances. Now he's talking about the new threat, terrorism, faceless threat. That is why he's talking about a new kind of coalition, new kind of alliance among the countries to fight terrorism. The problem is whether Pakistan is going to be on board. So, and the problem is whether the focus is going to be Africa or this part of the world. So he has not spelled out in detail what he means by it, but he is very clear that this is the major threat. This threat is going to continue. Let us have a new kind of alliance system.
All right. We need to take a break at this point again. We'll be back again in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing President Obama's attempt at resetting US foreign policy goals. Admiral Raja Menon, we're discussing how the US views terrorism now. Do you think at one level Obama was signaling that militancy in Afghanistan will now be seen on a par with the kind of Islamic militancy that exists in Mali and Yemen, and that US action henceforth against terrorism would be more restrained and more defined?
There is a slight difference. And the difference is the American confidence, whether it is misplaced or justified, in the Afghan National Army, in the sense that the Taliban in Afghanistan will have to contend with the Afghan National Army, which will probably continue to get military and financial support from the United States. I mean, you asked earlier as to why don't they put the other nations together? But when it actually comes to funding and fighting, the allies are generally not there. So the United States has found that it is alone eventually. So the difference between Yemen, Mali, Somalia, Niger and Afghanistan is the fact that here they have gone through the process of training a 250,000 man army, which will presumably be able to take on the Taliban and prevent a recurrence of the old thing of them occupying Kabul. I mean, that's not going to happen again. So
well,
there is
let's hope not. Let's hope not. But let me ask you a slightly different question, Neelam. If the US does not want to fight major military entanglements, how do you think Obama's Syria policy will shape up now? Because the choices there are pretty messy. You wanted to oust Bashar al-Assad. You've not been able to do that. Now you want to fight the jihadis. To fight the jihadis, would you need the cooperation of Assad? So how do you see the Syria policy shaping up?
Actually, I see that it can follow the pattern on chemical weapons, where eventually they cooperated with President Assad's government. And there is already quite a lot in the media in the United States that they will work with Assad to take on certain groups in Syria. Now, it will be a very odd coalition because there will be, as we have heard before in our part of the world about the moderate Taliban, there are going to be moderate terrorist groups in Syria who will fight the ones who are more Islamist, if you like, or more terrorist, so but along with assistance from the existing government.
So the more moderate terrorists would be trained by American troops.
That's what the money is supposed to be for.
Yeah, so you know, we've all discussed this $5 billion counterterrorism fund. So just a quick answer on this. what is new about it? Because US has thrown money at terrorism in Iraq, it has thrown money at terrorism in Afghanistan, it threw money at Pakistan to counter certain kind of forces in Afghanistan. So what is new? And suppose it was clearly defined what it was for, why was this fund not set up 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
2-3 quick lines. Number one, the amount of money the Americans have invested in Afghanistan is huge, about $1 trillion plus. Now they can't afford to do that. Right now the US has two deficits. One is the resource deficit and the other one is the confidence. The way the Russians and the Chinese are behaving, one in an aggressive way, the other one in an assertive way, Americans are not in a position to really tackle them. So in this new kind of situation, when he's saying that I will invest only $5 billion, but others are going to come on board and they will also cooperate, it is in a way SMSing to different allies about defense burden sharing in tackling terrorism.
All right.
If I may just add one line to
Quickly.
that, already they are saying that France will deal with Northern Africa and they will support French efforts there. So there is a division of labor, so to speak.
Okay, Admiral, do you think Obama has a clear strategy of dealing with a swaggering Russia at its borders and Chinese expansionism?
I don't think so. For instance, his pivot to the east, followed by the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
I mean, that raises more doubts than it answers questions. I mean, to have an economic integration in the Pacific region and leave China out would be a catastrophic move. Yeah. On the other hand, that is not the signal that's coming out. It is that the map shows that China will be a future member in the economic partnership. So, if there is going to be economic integration to prevent the occurrence of war and having economic groupings, this is understandable. Okay. And co-opting China into a move like that is understandable. But it doesn't come through clearly as to what the American motive is.
Russia, quickly?
Again, the problem is, I mean, Russia and China are also affected by Islamic fundamentalism. One would think that there is a common motive
so no
to get together on those issues.
All right. So, Obama doctrine, as you were trying to define it earlier, is really that US will fight for its core interests, it's fight for its allies, and it won't fight where its direct interests are not involved. So, are new red lines being drawn? As somebody wrote, they said this would mean that the US won't fight for Ukraine and Georgia, but Japan it will fight for, but it won't fight for Vietnam. Now, how does it help to define these red lines?
I don't know if they are red lines, but I would see them more as bottom lines. It's kind of saying, you know, we will put up with quite a lot, but not too much. It's also conceding more or less equality to China as a co-power.
All right. So, how come pivot to Asia was completely missing in this speech? You know, and we in India are totally taken up because we think we'll be beneficiaries of pivot to Asia.
You know, I find that Obama's speech is overall full of contradictions. On the one hand, he talks about pivot to Asia and how
he doesn't talk about pivot to Asia.
No. In the past, in the past, very recently, he talked about he visited Asia. He visited Japan, South Korea. Everywhere he talked about the pivot to Asia. But now he is citing scriptures. Respect international institutions. Americans must respect United Nations organization. So there is a contradiction. That is why most of the American allies, particularly in Asia, are really worried about the speech. That what is Obama going to do in the face of growing Chinese assertiveness? On the other hand, so-called adversaries or potential adversaries like China and Russia are really smiling that Americans are not in a position to really tackle the kind of assertiveness that they are showing.
Okay. Now, this is a question to all of you, so take your time answering it. How should India view this speech? Are there any new signals that India can benefit from, learn from, or know the American mind better about this region?
No, I think one of the conspicuous absences in the speech has been the strategic role of India. The economic role of India did come up, saying that they...
Along with Brazil.
Yes, along with Brazil, that they are going to have huge middle classes. But the strategic role of India was definitely absent. Okay. And we need to make a scenario analysis of our own as to what kind of world are we going to be living in 10 years down the line. Is it going to be still a world dominated by the United States, or has the United States given ground to the others?
All right. Professor Mohapatra?
You know, India has to be really alert and aware about the kind of signals that he has sent. on the one hand, he was talking about making India a linchpin of American strategy in the Asia Pacific, but right now he's talking about liberal internationalism. So in principle, we should be happy, but in reality, we should be really reading between the lines.
Last word to you, Neelam.
I think this address did not have. India was not part of the thinking for this speech. I think India needs to set out its own agenda, and then maybe others can see where it fits in with their agendas.
All right, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for coming here and analyzing this so-called resetting of US foreign policy for our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.